John Dillinger was an American gangster who became a household name during the Great Depression. Between June 1933 and July 1934, Dillinger and his gang terrorized the Midwest, robbing banks and police armories, staging jailbreaks, and engaging in shootouts. He was implicated in at least 10 slayings and multiple injuries to law enforcement officers. Dillinger's headline-grabbing heists transformed him into a notorious folk figure. In response to public fascination and his escalating crimes, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover named Dillinger Public Enemy Number 1, making the outlaw a priority target for federal agents. By mid-1934, Dillinger was America's most wanted criminal, his exploits romanticized in newspapers, even as authorities closed in on him. According to official records, John Dillinger met his end on July 22, 1934, outside Chicago's Biograph Theater. That evening, Dillinger went to see the gangster film Manhattan Melodrama with two women, Polly Hamilton, his girlfriend at the time, and Anna Sage. Unbeknownst to Dillinger, Anna Sage had secretly alerted law enforcement to his whereabouts. Sage had arranged to lead Dillinger into a trap and point him out to agents in hopes of collecting a $5,000 reward. This was the equivalent of over $100,000 today, which, all things considered, seems fairly low for the risks involved in taking out a high-profile organized crime figure. Local police and FBI agents under Agent Melvin Purvis set up an ambush outside the theater. Around 10:30 p.m., as Dillinger exited the Biograph with the two women, Purvis signaled the attack by lighting a cigar. Dillinger sensed the trap and attempted to flee, reportedly reaching for a pistol in his pocket, at least according to the official narrative. In response, a group of agents opened fire, pumping Dillinger full of lead. Dillinger collapsed to the pavement, and he was quickly taken to a nearby hospital, where he was pronounced dead at around 11 that evening. Notably, throngs of curious onlookers gathered to glimpse Dillinger's corpse, with some dipping handkerchiefs in his blood as morbid souvenirs. The body was publicly identified as John Dillinger and was put on display for a time, in part to convince a fascinated public that the outlaw was truly dead. He was buried in Crown Hill Cemetery in his hometown of Indianapolis. Fearing grave robbers and relic hunters, Dillinger's family later had his coffin reinterred under a protective cap of concrete and iron, topped by heavy concrete slabs. This unusual step likely wasn't a bad idea, considering that people were willing to soak up his blood at the scene where he was shot down. By all official accounts, the story seemed closed. John Dillinger was dead and buried in 1934, and the FBI's top gangland nemesis was no more. Almost immediately after Dillinger's shooting, whispers began to circulate that the FBI might have gotten the wrong man. Such theories often spring up around larger-than-life figures, much as rumors later claimed that Elvis Presley or Michael Jackson had faked their deaths. In Dillinger's case, a number of odd discrepancies and inconsistencies were noted in the aftermath of the shooting. These fueled speculation that the man killed at the Biograph Theater was not John Dillinger at all. One of the first puzzling details was the corpse's eye color. Contemporary morgue records from 1934 listed the dead man's eyes as brown, yet Dillinger was known to have had gray-blue eyes. This discrepancy was highlighted in a Cook County coroner's report rediscovered decades later. Medical experts cautioned that eye color can appear clouded or darker after death. There were other physical mismatches as well. The body in the morgue had none of Dillinger's well-documented scars or past bullet wound marks, according to accounts of the autopsy. Dillinger, who was 31, had been injured several times during his criminal career, and even underwent clandestine plastic surgery while on the run in an attempt to alter his appearance. Yet the autopsy report supposedly noted no signs of recent facial surgery on the body. Notably, the corpse was also said to have fingerprints, despite Dillinger allegedly having physically removed his own fingerprints with acid. Theorists argue that if Dillinger had truly undergone facial alteration and tried to remove his fingerprints, the lack of surgical scars and the intact prints on the body make little sense. That is, unless it was someone else's body entirely. Perhaps most striking, the autopsy noted that the dead man suffered from a chronic heart condition that had scarred his heart since childhood. Dillinger, however, was by all accounts a very healthy fellow, having played semi-pro baseball, and was known for athletic feats during robberies and prison breaks. A person with advanced heart disease would likely have been severely limited, which didn't match Dillinger's lifestyle. This detail of a bad heart in the corpse raised eyebrows. Additionally, some witnesses remarked that the body appeared shorter and heavier than Dillinger's known build. Even Dillinger's facial features, such as the shape of the ears and the front teeth, were reported to differ from known photos of the outlaw. Such claims, though anecdotal, bolstered the idea that something was off in the official story. At the time, law enforcement attributed any minor differences to Dillinger's attempts at disguise. The FBI pointed out that Dillinger had grown a mustache, dyed his hair, and undergone plastic surgery to remove identifying moles and scars, which could account for a changed appearance. They also emphasized that fingerprints taken from the body matched Dillinger's fingerprints on record, seemingly settling the matter. According to the FBI, agents at the scene obtained 2 sets of prints from the corpse, which both positively identified Dillinger. They also confirmed a 3rd matching set was taken during the official autopsy. The FBI discounted the idea that Dillinger had ever removed his fingerprints, suggesting that this was part of the myth-making surrounding this outlaw. These forensic matches, in the Bureau's view, were definitive proof that the correct man was killed. However, skeptics have long alleged that this fingerprint evidence might have been falsified or mishandled. The reason for this, according to theorists, is that the FBI blasted a Dillinger look-alike and then planted evidence to save face. Effectively, they needed to cover up blasting a doppelganger down on the streets of Chicago. According to this theory, Dillinger, realizing that the FBI had taken the bait either intentionally or to save face, decided it was a good time to quit his life of crime. Other rumors and anecdotal reports have added to the legend. In the years following 1934, there were occasional claims of Dillinger sightings around the country, as often happens with infamous figures whose deaths some refuse to believe. It was said, for instance, that Dillinger's sister suddenly began taking trips to California in the late 1930s, sparking talk that she was secretly visiting her fugitive brother. Some members of Dillinger's own family long harbored doubts about the body, believing it wasn't really him. In fact, when Dillinger's father first viewed the corpse in Chicago, he reportedly blurted that it did not look like his son. He noticed unfamiliar features like differently shaped eyes and a changed physique, according to later retellings. However, according to the official narrative, this is because Dillinger had deliberately undergone plastic surgery to alter his appearance. Further, skeptics note that bodies and facial features change rapidly post-mortem, which combined with the surgery could have resulted in him looking entirely different. For mainstream historians and the FBI, John Dillinger's fate has never truly been in question. The consensus is that Dillinger died that night in Chicago, and the survival theories are viewed as far-fetched urban legends surrounding this larger-than-life bandit. And of course, it's necessary to note that Dillinger is one of the most notorious criminals in American history. Much like Billy the Kid or Butch Cassidy or any other famous outlaw, the stories about him have just continued to grow in the last century or so. Notably, Dillinger still has numerous living relatives, and in 2019, they attempted to literally dig up the past and run DNA tests to confirm things once and for all. However, this was stopped when another faction of the Dillinger family went ahead and started a legal dispute to stop the exhumation process. Apparently, those Dillingers sure are a contentious bunch, even to this day. In the end, whether John Dillinger truly died on that Chicago street or lived on under an alias may never be conclusively proven, barring DNA testing. In the early 20th century, Chicago's underworld had an undisputed king in Big Jim Colosimo. Born Vincenzo Colosimo in 1878 in Italy, he came to Chicago as a teenager and rose from shoeshiner and petty thief to the city's foremost vice lord. By the 1900s, Big Jim, also known as Diamond Jim for his love of flashy jewelry, controlled a thriving criminal empire. He married a prominent madam in 1902 and befriended local corrupt politicians. Backed by these corrupt city officials, Big Jim consolidated the city's vice operations into a lucrative racket. In doing so, he effectively laid the foundation for what would later be known as the Chicago Outfit. Big Jimmy's power and popularity were notable, and he very clearly wasn't your typical shady underworld figure who attempted to keep a low profile. Big Jim was, to put it simply, a man of big appetites. He was a jovial, outgoing figure who reveled in his success, earning him the Big Jim moniker as much for his personality as for his stature. By the 1910s, he owned the opulent Colosimo's Cafe on South Wabash Avenue, a nightclub where Chicago's high society rubbed shoulders with underworld figures. Celebrities and politicians alike dined at Colosimo's establishment, underscoring the influence he wielded in both crime and city politics. That said, with Chicago politics at the time, there wasn't too much difference between the two regardless. To guard his growing empire, Big Jim brought in his relative by marriage, Johnny Torrio, from New York in 1909. By 1920, Colosimo had spent nearly 2 decades at the top of Chicago's vice world, seemingly untouchable as the city's crime boss. However, the fact that Big Jim isn't a household name, while Al Capone is one of the most famous gangsters in history, should tell you that Jim wouldn't be around for much longer. The enactment of Prohibition in January 1920 presented a new illicit opportunity: bootlegging booze. Torrio urged Big Jim to capitalize on this lucrative trade, but Colosimo balked. He was content with his thriving underground businesses and feared that large-scale bootlegging would draw unwanted federal attention. Big Jimmy may have had every corrupt Chicago politician in his pocket, but the same couldn't be said for the feds. At the same time, Colosimo's personal life was in flux. He divorced Victoria Moresco, who was also Torrio's aunt, in early 1920, and quickly married a young singer, Dale Winter, in April of that year. This combination of a personal split and a business disagreement with Torrio may have proven to be fateful. Colosimo's reluctance to embrace the new bootleg liquor racket left his ambitious lieutenant increasingly frustrated, and his sudden divorce and marriage upset old alliances. The stage was set for a violent change at the top, and as they say, the bigger they are, the harder they fall. On May 11th, 1920, just weeks after his wedding, Big Jim arrived at his lavish restaurant expecting a business meeting that he would never leave alive. That afternoon, Colosimo had phoned his new bride to say he'd be late for dinner because he had an important meeting with an unknown man at his restaurant. The cafe was closed between meal services with only a few staff on site when Big Jimmy swaggered in looking for his appointment. He asked a waiter if anyone had been by, and hearing no, Big Jim went to his office to wait. The ambiance was eerily quiet. No patrons, just the clink of dishes in the kitchen and the shuffle of employees preparing for meal service that evening. After a short while with no sign of his expected guest, Colosimo grew uneasy and stepped out of his office into the lobby. At that very moment, an assailant was lying in wait. As Colosimo peered through a door toward the street, perhaps looking for a visitor, a figure crept up from behind. A sudden shot cracked through the empty restaurant. Big Jim was struck in the back of the head, hitting the base of his skull. He collapsed instantly, sprawled on the marble floor of his own upscale cafe. The perpetrator had timed the attack perfectly. Colosimo was alone and unguarded in that brief moment. In the aftermath, the shooter slipped out into the afternoon light, vanishing before anyone could stop him. The slaying of such a prominent mob boss sparked immediate theories, and Chicago's rumor mill went into overdrive. The press originally attempted to tie it all to his controversial divorce and remarriage, suggesting his ex-wife wanted Jimmy cut down to size. While this may have sold papers, there was simply no evidence for it, and other more plausible theories began to emerge. Besides the jilted ex-wife angle, another early theory pointed to the Black Hand, a shadowy network of Southern Italian extortionists. In establishing the Chicago outfit, Big Jim and his boys had ended up piling up members of this loosely organized group into Chicago gutters. Some speculated that those old vendettas had finally caught up to him in 1920, and the authorities knew he was a marked man in these circles. However, these Black Hand groups were already in massive decline by 1920, and no evidence tied these groups to the attack. These accusations helped deflect attention from what would soon emerge as the most likely scenario, an inside job from within Colosimo's own outfit. Scrutinizing who stood to gain from Big Jim's demise led investigators and informed observers to focus on Johnny Torrio, Colosimo's trusted underboss. Torrio had been loyally running Colosimo's operations and protecting him for years, yet he also had the ambition and foresight that Big Jim increasingly lacked. With prohibition in effect, Torrio was eager to dive into bootlegging and rack up fortunes as a booze baron, but Colosimo's stubborn refusal was an obstacle. Eliminating Colosimo cleared the way for Torrio to take over and transform the organization, and almost immediately after the slaying, Torrio's behavior raised eyebrows. He took charge of the situation with remarkable poise and organized an extravagant funeral for Big Jim, all while beginning to exercise power in his own right. To many observers, it looked as though the old lion had been felled by an up-and-comer, and the pride was now firmly under the control of Johnny and a new generation of mobsters. Or, in this analogy, new generation of lions. But hey, it sounded kind of silly when I read it aloud. The most widely accepted theory is that Johnny Torrio ordered the hit on Big Jim. According to this theory, Torrio privately arranged for a trusted hitman from New York to do the job, keeping his own hands as clean as possible in the circumstances. Torrio had connections to the New York underworld from his earlier days, notably his friendship with Frankie Yale, a notorious Brooklyn mobster. In the spring of 1920, Torrio supposedly reached out to Yale for help eliminating Big Jim, knowing that an out-of-town professional would arouse less suspicion among Chicago police. By some accounts, Torrio even convened a meeting with New York gang leaders to get their blessing for him to become Chicago's new boss, once Colosimo was gone. Another name inevitably surfaced in the rumor mill: Al Capone. Capone was a young protege of Torrio, who had recently arrived from New York to help with Colosimo's enterprises. Later legends accused Capone of very direct involvement in the whacking of Big Jim, with some even claiming that Al Capone himself was the trigger man. However, most historians find this unlikely, as Capone was still an up-and-comer at the time and may not have been trusted with such a big job. Further, it remains an open question if Capone was even in Chicago on the day in question. It's more plausible that Capone's role was to help Torrio consolidate power after Big Jim was gone, rather than to execute the hit himself. Ultimately, whether or not Capone had any direct hand in the attack, he unquestionably benefited from it. The slaying of Big Jim removed the old guard and opened the door for Torrio and Capone's generation to take over Chicago. And the rest, as they say, is history. While the whodunit was never proven in court, the Torrio-Yale theory remains the most compelling and widely accepted. That said, Big Jim spent his life running up untrustworthy friends and bitter foes in equal measure, so the question can never be answered with complete certainty. In the winter of 1946, a quiet New England town became the center of a baffling mystery. 18-year-old Paula Weldon, a sophomore at Bennington College in Vermont, set off for an afternoon hike and was never seen again. Her sudden vanishing on December 1st, 1946, sparked one of the largest searches in Vermont's history. Paula Weldon was, by all accounts, an intelligent and friendly young woman. She was the eldest of 4 daughters of an accomplished engineer from Stamford, Connecticut, and had a promising future ahead of her. At Bennington College, Paula was known for her artistic interests and had recently developed a passion for gardening and plant life. Despite this outwardly bright disposition, those close to Paula noted that she had been feeling a bit blue in the days leading up to her disappearance. In fact, she had opted not to go home for Thanksgiving just a week earlier, after a disagreement with her father. The two had argued about a young man Paula had been seeing, a boyfriend who her father disapproved of. This tension, coupled with Paula's subdued mood, would later feed into various theories about what might have happened to her. But on that first Sunday of December, 1946, nothing seemed amiss, as Paula decided to take a study break and get some fresh air. That Sunday, Paula worked an early shift in the campus dining hall, then returned to her dormitory on campus in the early afternoon. Around 2:45 p.m., she told her roommate, Elizabeth Johnson, that she was taking a study break and going for a long walk. She didn't specify exactly where she was headed, but being a mild day for early December, a hike in the surrounding woods seemed plausible. She didn't take any spare clothes or gear for a long trip. No backpack, no money, no overnight provisions, indicating she expected to be back within a few hours. Wearing a red coat in the woods might normally make someone more visible, yet that striking red jacket would soon become a haunting detail in her story. Eyewitness accounts later helped piece together Paula's movements that afternoon. Leaving campus, Paula walked down the long college driveway to the main road and began hitchhiking toward the trailheads outside of town. A driver, a local contractor heading east on Route 9, picked up a young woman matching Paula's description near the Bennington campus entrance. He led her out near Woodford Hollow, close to the start of the Long Trail, a popular long-distance hiking trail that cuts through the Green Mountains. Interestingly, the distinctive red jacket stuck out to the driver. From there, Paula continued on foot. Several people reported seeing a girl in a red coat along the road and at the trail entrance. One group of hikers later recalled crossing paths with Paula as they were coming down the trail, and she was going up. Again, she stood out because she was wearing her very distinctive red coat. They remembered her asking for directions about the long trail and how to follow it north toward Glastonbury Mountain. These hikers, aware that dusk was approaching, had cautioned Paula that the day was ending, and she wasn't dressed for an extended hike in the coming cold. Paula nevertheless pressed on up the trail alone. As daylight faded on that quiet woodland path, she was observed walking northward near an area known as Harbor Road. That was the last confirmed sighting of Paula Weldon. She headed into the woods as the sun went down and the darkness of a December night closed in. And somehow, in that brief span of time, Paula vanished. When Paula failed to return to campus that night, it didn't immediately raise alarm. Students often studied late or stayed with friends. Her roommate assumed Paula might be cramming at the library or had spontaneously gone to visit someone. But by the next morning, on Monday, Paula still hadn't returned, which was deeply out of character. Concern quickly mounted, and the college administration was notified, and they in turn alerted local authorities. The search for Paula Weldon rapidly became a massive operation. Bennington College suspended classes so that students and faculty could help scour the campus and surrounding areas. Police from nearby areas, firefighters, and hundreds of local volunteers joined the effort. The Vermont National Guard even dispatched troops to assist in combing the wilderness. The search parties concentrated on the Long Trail area where Paula had been seen. They trudged through woods, waded across streams, and poked into every area they could find. Plans were made for aerial searches, and small planes flew over the forested hills, looking for any bright red dot that might be Paula's coat. The weather had turned frigid, and at night a dusting of snow covered the ground, complicating the effort. Despite the manpower and the urgent determination, no trace of Paula was found. Not a shoe print, not a shred of cloth. It was as if she had stepped off the trail and simply disappeared into thin air. News of the missing Bennington College sophomore spread quickly, capturing regional attention. The Bennington Banner newspaper printed Paula's photograph, which helped jog the memories of witnesses who came forward to say they had seen her on Sunday. Tips and alleged sightings started pouring in from all over New England. People in Vermont, New York, and Massachusetts reported catching glimpses of young women who resembled Paula. At one point, a waitress in Fall River, Massachusetts, claimed she had served an upset-looking girl fitting Paula's description the day after the disappearance. For Paula's anxious father, this tip offered a glimmer of hope. He personally traveled to Fall River to investigate. Unfortunately, that lead, like so many others, turned out to lead nowhere. Not long after, a train conductor in South Carolina reported a sighting of a woman who could have been Paula on board his train, but this too led nowhere. Days turned into weeks, and the promising leads dwindled one by one, each dead end deepening the mystery. As the field searches failed to produce results, the investigation shifted into other gears. Recognizing that Vermont at the time lacked a dedicated state police force, Paula's father, William Weldon, grew frustrated with the local sheriff's efforts. He openly criticized the lack of organization and resources. Indeed, it later emerged that in the critical first days of the search, the local sheriffs hadn't even kept proper written records of the investigation. This was a shocking lapse that could have allowed important clues to slip away. Desperate for more expertise, Paula's father used his influence to persuade the Vermont governor to request outside help. Law enforcement officers from New York, Massachusetts, and Paula's home state of Connecticut arrived to assist. The FBI was also consulted due to the possibility that Paula could have been kidnapped and taken across state lines, though no evidence of that ever surfaced. With bolstered ranks, investigators started re-interviewing everyone who had been near the Long Trail that day. They knocked on doors of every house along the route Paula was known to have taken. One name soon emerged as a possible lead: Fred Gaudette, a local lumberjack who lived in a cabin along Harbor Road near the trail. Gaudette was reportedly one of the last people who might have crossed paths with Paula. On that Sunday, he had been at his cabin in the midst of a heated argument with his girlfriend. In a rage, Gaudette stormed out of the house around the same time Paula would have been passing by. Initially, he told police he went straight to his shack and spent the evening alone. At other times, he claimed he had driven up the trail in his truck after their argument. These conflicting accounts made detectives suspicious that he might be hiding something. In fact, over the ensuing weeks and even years, he would change his story multiple times. On one occasion, he even boasted drunkenly to acquaintances that he knew where Paula's body was buried. However, when pressed by police in later interviews, Gaudette recanted and said he made it up for attention. Investigators found no hard evidence linking the lumberjack to Paula's disappearance. No body, no sign of a struggle, nothing. Without evidence of a crime, Gaudette remained only a person of interest and never was formally charged. His involvement, if any, remains an unsettled question, but many who have studied the case continue to view him with suspicion given his inconsistent statements. With no breakthroughs in the case, the ground search eventually wound down after several weeks. By mid-December 1946, many volunteers had gone home, and snow had blanketed the Green Mountains, making further searching futile until spring. Paula's father, exhausted and heartsick, left Vermont around December 16th to return to Connecticut, bitterly disappointed at not finding his daughter. Small-scale searches would continue into January, and when the snows melted the following spring, teams once again ventured onto the Long Trail again, hoping to find a clue, but in vain. Early on, many who knew Paula feared she had simply gotten lost or injured on the trail. Perhaps she had strayed from the path, fallen into a ravine or hidden crevice, or succumbed to the cold when night fell. It's true that December nights in Vermont can be unforgiving. Temperatures can drop well below freezing. Dressed lightly and caught in darkness, Paula could have become disoriented, maybe suffering hypothermia. If she had gotten hurt or lost, one would expect searchers to eventually find a trace. Yet the complete lack of any physical evidence lent doubt to the simple lost hiker theory. The most unsettling theory, and the one that law enforcement often leans toward in such cases, is foul play. Perhaps Paula encountered the wrong person in the woods that day. If someone harmed Paula, it could explain why no trace of her was found. The remote Long Trail area, with its dense woods and abandoned old logging roads, could conceal a crime. While Fred Gaudette is a prime suspect, some have proposed the idea of a possible serial predator. In a 5-year span from 1945 to 1950, 5 people vanished in the same Vermont wilderness without a trace. This chilling potential pattern would later inspire local lore about the so-called Bennington Triangle, a place where some eerie force or unknown serial perpetrator might be at work. Meanwhile, Paula's family had to carry on without answers. Eventually, Paula was declared legally dead in absentia, but not until years later, when hope of her return had faded and legal matters had to be settled. Today, nearly 80 years later, the disappearance of Paula Weldon remains open in the Vermont State Police files, officially unsolved.